I'm Nima Rajan. Nova Scotia's progressive Conservatives have been voted into power in an upset, giving them a majority government with 31 seats in the legislature. Premier-designate Tim Houston's party grabbed the attention of voters by campaigning on a big spending fix for the troubled health system. In his victory speech, the 51-year-old chartered accountant lauded those same voters for braving the pandemic to hold the previous government accountable. Federal party leaders tackled the issue of mandatory vaccinations on the campaign trail today, with Liberal leader Justin Trudeau facing anti-mask protesters in Aurora, Ontario. Conservative leader Erin O'Toole says vaccines are critical, noting he publicly posted about getting his shot months after testing positive for COVID-19. NDP leader Jagmeet Singh says he supports mandatory vaccinations for federal workers and would go so far as to fire those who don't comply. Justin Trudeau has revealed that all Canadian diplomats have left Afghanistan. His Liberal government faces fresh criticism and calls for action to save hundreds of former interpreters and their families still stuck inside the country. Mr. Trudeau says a total of 9 flights out of Afghanistan have arrived in Canada over the past few weeks. Statistics Canada says the annual pace of inflation rose to 3.7% in July, which is the biggest increase since May 2011. The year-over-year increase in the Consumer Price Index compared with a 3.1% increase in June. Excluding gasoline, the Consumer Price Index for July increased 2.8% compared with a year ago. The largest driver of overall price growth stemmed from the country's housing market, as homeowner replacement costs rose 13.8% year-over-year, which is the largest increase since October 1987. The Trudeau government is dropping its bid to have a court prohibit the disclosure of documents related to the firing of 2 scientists at Canada's highest security laboratory. A House of Commons order to produce the documents was terminated, along with all other business before the House when Parliament was dissolved Sunday for an election. Consequently, a Justice Department official says no purpose would be served in continuing the government's application to the federal court to block the release of the documents. He initially spearheaded Canada's vaccine rollout campaign, but this morning he presented himself to police over a charge of sexual assault. Through his lawyers, Major General Danny Fortin is denying any wrongdoing and says his reputation has been badly damaged by the allegation. His legal team is also questioning the timing of the charge, with lawyer Natalia Rodriguez pointing to the launch of the federal election just days before. The Liberals have been criticized for months for not doing more to address sexual misconduct in the Canadian military. A trip through British Columbia may be ill-advised at this time as the province continues to battle more than 260 wildfires. Public Safety Minister Mike Farnworth says the provincial state of emergency is being extended until the end of the month. More than 8,200 properties around the province were on evacuation order as of yesterday. That's a leap of nearly 2,000 since Friday. Alberta Health Services has filed an unfair labor practice complaint with the Alberta Labor Relations Board, saying the nurses' union is bargaining in bad faith. The government agency alleges the United Nurses of Alberta is falsely saying that registered nurses are being recruited through a third party at a higher rate of pay while contract talks are going on. The union responded that ads posted by those recruiters have been seen by hundreds of people in Alberta and other provinces. The Saskatchewan government says people who got a combination of AstraZeneca, Pfizer, or Moderna COVID-19 vaccines can now receive a 3rd dose. It says additional doses will be permitted for those who may require them for international travel. Saskatchewan Premier Scott Moe says BHP's approval of $7.5 billion in spending on the Jansen potash mine is the largest economic investment in the province's history. The Australian mining giant says the project will create up to 3,500 construction jobs and 600 permanent jobs. Mr. Moe says the investment highlights the strength of the provincial potash resource and will help build a strong economy. Ontario is rolling out some new policy approaches to tackle the COVID-19 pandemic. Transplant recipients, patients with certain cancers, and long-term care and retirement home residents will be offered 3rd vaccine doses, starting as early as this week. Health and education workers will also need to be fully immunized or will have to undergo regular COVID tests. Quebec Premier François Legault is making COVID-19 vaccinations mandatory for healthcare workers. He says the 10% who haven't had their shots pose a risk to patients. He hasn't decided what the penalties will be for those who refuse to be vaccinated. All right, stay with us. We'll have an interview on geopolitical events, elections, and inflation up next. Stay tuned for our finance segment with Brendan Caldwell of Caldwell Securities Limited when we return from the break. Stay with us for more news from around the world on Forum Daily shortly after these messages. We'll be right back. The election spotlight could shift today to Canada's pandemic-ravaged economy and debt-laden federal finances as Statistics Canada reveals its Consumer Price Index for July. Statistics Canada says the annual pace of inflation rose to 3.7% in July, which is the biggest increase since May 2011. The inflation rate has exceeded the Bank of Canada's target of 2% since April, and some economists expect it to creep as high as 3.9% in the fall. Bank of Canada Governor Tiff Macklem has argued that price increases are temporary, the result of supply chain disruptions during COVID-19 lockdowns, and that allowing inflation to remain temporarily high will help the economy rebound from the pandemic-induced recession. Regardless, inflation is not the only economic consideration. Geopolitical events, like the situation in Afghanistan, could also affect the markets. Well, joining us now to talk more on this is Brendan Caldwell, the director of Caldwell Securities Limited. Brendan, always great having you on Forum Daily. Welcome back.
Thanks for having me, Nima.
So let's start with this. How might all of the geopolitical events going on, like Afghanistan, as we mentioned, affect the markets?
Regrettably, I think they'll affect them very little. If we're just talking about Afghanistan, I think if the President of the United States and the Western world deeply and profoundly still cared about Afghanistan, we wouldn't have left them to the tender mercies of the Taliban. My regiment, the Queen's Own Rifles of Canada, was deeply involved in securing that country's well-being for a decade with over 70 of our members there. And it's just heartbreaking to see them just left. But the Western world, the markets as a whole, they don't really care. So it might be an election issue in some way, but I think as cynically as this might sound, Nima, the world is just going to roll on without them.
All right, Brendan. Well, we are in the middle of a federal election right now. What are you hoping is going to be discussed during this election as it relates to Canada's economic recovery from the pandemic?
Well, I think there's two different models that the government could go with, and I think the choices are making themselves evident. One is a model that will see the government revenues improved by raising taxes. That I think will end up being a futile attempt because if without economic growth, and the usual engines for economic growth in Canada are being blocked, particularly the energy sector may not have the longest future ahead of it. So if we don't get economic growth in other areas, I think we'll have an issue. So there's two ways of approaching it. Either you raise taxes to raise government revenue, or you encourage growth. I'm really hoping that we land on the latter, because I think that's going to be better, not just for all Canadians, but particularly for younger Canadians that really haven't benefited from the growth of the last 30 or 40 years.
Now, I want to go back to what Tiff Macklem, the Bank of Canada governor, is saying. He's arguing that keeping inflation temporarily high would help the economy rebound from the pandemic-induced recession. So can you tell us a little bit more on what he means by that? Well,
inflation, which was the boogeyman from my youth, when inflation was in the double digits, is still better than deflation. When you expect something to be worth more tomorrow than it is today, you're going to buy it today. So to a point, it does stimulate economic activity because people buy things. If you think something's going to be worth less tomorrow than it is today, you're going to hold off buying it till tomorrow. And that feeds on itself and you get a recession, or in worst case, a depression. So yes, a bit of inflation is better than no inflation, and is certainly better than deflation.
But meanwhile, we have economists saying that inflation could spike higher than what Mr. Macklem is saying. How would that impact the economy, Brendan?
I think the tricky bit will be higher interest rates. The whole world is now budgeted for very low interest rates. From governments all the way down to someone buying their first home, we're expecting low single-digit interest rates. If we see inflation go higher, then the price of money, interest rates, will likely go higher with that. So if we have 3 and 4% inflation, we'll see 5 and 6% interest rates. And I don't think the world has budgeted for that. So that, more than Afghanistan or anything else, will likely have a an effect on the markets, because at the end of the day, interest rates really are the determining factor.
All right, Brendan, just about half a minute left here, but the Conservatives are suggesting a GST-free December, considering businesses might not be equipped for this as HST is already in their systems. How do you feel this would work?
Well, I like where his head is at, in as much as, given what I said earlier, the choice between more taxes and greater growth, at least he's going for the idea of greater growth, stimulating the economy, getting people out doing things. I am not a computer programmer. I imagine it's more difficult than just pushing a button saying don't charge HST in December. But with all the things that we've managed to handle the last year and a half, I think we could probably handle not paying HST for a month somehow.
The Nova Scotia Progressive Conservatives have won a majority government in the provincial election. With all but 2 of 55 ridings called Tuesday night, the Tories were elected in 31 districts. Tory leader Tim Houston said the public responded to the solutions he put forward and decided against simply rewarding the Liberals for proficiently handling the COVID-19 pandemic. Despite the defeat, Liberal leader Ian Rankin says he has no plans to step down. Joining us today to discuss the election results is Dr. Laurie Turnbull, the director of the School of Public Administration and an associate professor of political science at Dalhousie University. Doctor, welcome to Forum Daily.
Thanks so much for having me on.
So let's start with a quick overview of the Nova Scotia campaign and the results today.
Sure. So the campaign was almost necessary as compared to the federal one. The federal campaign being called, not even 2 years into the mandate. The Liberal government was actually in the 5th year of their mandate. We don't have fixed election dates in Nova Scotia, so it was sort of time to get on with it in a way. The parties aren't hugely different ideologically, like they have some things that set them apart, but for the most part, they all are focused on things like healthcare, affordable housing, mental health services, environment, things like that. And so there was a bit of a sense that voters might move around because all of the parties were offering sort of similar kinds of platforms. Again, some differences kind of keeping them apart, but there's not a huge space between the parties.
So what would you say has been the biggest takeaway for you after watching this election?
Well, at the beginning, it really looked like Premier Rankin and the Liberals were going to win it. And he was hugely ahead in the polls. I mean, we knew that lead would soften a bit once the campaign started because during COVID, we didn't have really any meetings of the legislature here. And so normal politics was done and the focus was really on the government. It looked like the Liberals were going to take it all, but then campaigns matter. As we went through, more people shifted their vote. The other parties, the other leaders had more of an impact on the conversation and they resonated more. And now instead of what people thought was probably going to be a majority Liberal government, we have majority PC.
And considering that this provincial election was held during the pandemic, how did the provincial parties adapt their campaigns to the situation with COVID-19?
So we don't have a lot of COVID in Nova Scotia. I think we have fewer than 10 cases now. And throughout the campaign, there was not any sort of growth in cases. We have a high vaccination rate here. So they have to still do, kind of what is expected in terms of masking and things like that. The leaders roundtable was virtual rather than in person. But for the most part, I don't think it affected things a huge amount. Like they were still able to go out and door knock and meet with people and things like that.
Now, turning to the current federal election, could you talk about some of the impacts that the pandemic may have on this particular election?
I think it's more complicated from the federal perspective because just of the size of the country, what's happening in Nova Scotia in the sense that there's not an acute sense of a public health crisis here. That's not necessarily going to be the case for all of the provinces for the entire election. Like we can see cases rising in Ontario and Alberta. And so the sense of safety we have here in Nova Scotia might not endure the entire campaign in every jurisdiction. So I think it's challenging from that perspective. It's also challenging in the sense that there are a number of people who really don't feel that this is the right time to have an election. They may choose not to engage at all. If the politicians may find it harder to haul their usual vote if people decide they're not going to switch on for this.
All right, Dr. Turnbull, just about a minute left, but I want to go back to an article in The Star that you were quoted in. You were discussing what we might expect from each of the front runners in this federal election. So could you share with us what challenges each party leader will face throughout this campaign?
Sure. I mean, starting with Trudeau, I think he's got a sense of momentum behind him. He called this election, I think, largely for strategic reasons. He wants his majority. And I think it's hard for him to argue against that. He's made some points around the election being a time for people to weigh in because we haven't had a chance to do that since COVID started. that's fine. But I think he still has to explain a bit, why we're out here. Now, that said, I don't think voters will punish him for it unless the situation with COVID gets worse and it starts to look like a safety concern. Aaron O'Toole and Jagmeet Singh are under a lot of pressure, I think, to prove themselves in this election. Singh didn't have as good a campaign the last time as he wanted, so he didn't have as good of results as he wanted. This time, I think there's a lot of pressure on him to show, despite the fact that the Liberals are really leaning left, he still has something to give to voters. Vote NDP, even though the Liberals want to give you a huge social safety net. For Aaron O'Toole, this is a make or break moment for him. He has released a Conservative campaign, which gives a lot of detail about what he wants to do and how he wants to rebuild after COVID, which is not about huge government programs. It's about governments giving money to businesses, individuals, and saying, invest this yourself, figure out how, you know best, you do your thing and we'll help you do it, which is a very different approach than the Liberal one. Annamie Paul is in a situation where the party is in civil war. I don't really know how the Greens are going to emerge from this, to be honest. Yves Blanchette is going to probably have a more tricky fight on his hands in Quebec this time than he did last time. The Liberals are very hungry for those seats in order to get the majority.
All right, Dr. Turnbull, we appreciate your expertise on Forum Daily. Thank you again for your time today.
Thank you, too.
Stay tuned. We'll be right back. British Prime Minister Boris Johnson updated parliamentarians about the situation in Afghanistan on Wednesday. This includes the evacuation of British nationals and local allies from Afghanistan, as well as the steps the government is taking to help Afghan citizens who are facing the return of the Taliban. Mr. Johnson on Wednesday said that 20,000 vulnerable Afghans would be given refuge in the UK over the next few years. Meanwhile, the Taliban have blown up the statue of a Shiite militia leader who had fought against them during Afghanistan's civil war in the 1990s. The statue depicted a militia leader killed by the Taliban in 1996 when the Islamic militants seized power from rival warlords. The statue stood in the central Bamyan province, where in 2001 the Taliban infamously blew up two massive 1,500-year-old statues of Buddha carved into a mountain. The Taliban claimed the Buddha violated Islam's prohibition of idolatry. New Zealand's first coronavirus outbreak in 6 months has grown to 7 people. The announcement comes a day after Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern imposed a strict lockdown after the first case was reported. The lockdown is set for at least 3 days for the country and at least a week for the cities of Auckland and Coromandel. The United Kingdom is calling for a pause to violence in Myanmar to allow for COVID-19 vaccinations. Unrest has followed the military takeover in Myanmar. Britain's deputy UN ambassador told reporters after Tuesday's closed Security Council discussions that the call for a humanitarian pause was joined by the new special envoy for Myanmar from the 10-member Association of Southeast Asian Nations. Polish government officials say nearly 1,000 troops have been deployed at the border with Belarus amid a surge of migrants, mostly from Iraq, seeking to enter the country. Poland, like Lithuania and other Baltic nations, accused Belarusian President Alexander Lukashenko of sending migrants across their borders, which is also the external border of the European Union. They accuse Mr. Lukashenko of using the migrants as instruments in a hybrid war. According to one detainee, small children are among those held amid a new wave of detentions of ethnic Tigrayans in Ethiopia's escalating war. This while witnesses and a human rights watchdog describe fresh disappearances in recent weeks. In an interview with the Associated Press on a hidden phone, the detainee describes grim conditions for more than 700 people at a camp in Ethiopia's Oromia region. Meanwhile, Human Rights Watch says authorities have carried out rampant arbitrary arrests and enforced disappearances of Tigrayans since the turn in the course of the war in June. Peru's foreign secretary has resigned amid criticism for comments he made about terrorism in the country in the late 20th century. He is leaving the new government of President Pedro Castillo less than a month after it assumed power. The government didn't cite any reason, but the opposition and some media have been criticizing the sociology professor and former guerrilla member for saying in the late 2020s that the Shining Path terrorist group was a CIA creation and that the Peruvian Navy had been responsible for terrorist acts. Cuba's government has spelled out laws against using social media or the internet to stir up protests or insult the state, and it's offering people a form to report offenders. The decrees follow the largest protests Cuba has seen in years, which broke out last month. They were apparently fed in part by messages on social media. One of the decrees forbids spreading content that attacks the constitutional, social, and economic rules of the state or that incite demonstrations or other acts that alter public order. China's ruling Communist Party has expelled a leading internet censor and accused him of a range of crimes and rule breaking. Peng Bo had been deputy head of a body set up after the party launched a sweeping crackdown against the Falun Gong meditation sect that is viewed as a threat to its authority. The party's disciplinary watchdog body said on its website that an investigation had found that Mr. Peng had been disloyal to the party, failed to implement its strict online controls, and illegally received large amounts of property. A deepening drought is threatening California's $6 billion almond industry, which produces about 80% of the world's almonds. As the drought drains reservoirs and forces water restrictions, critics say the crop isn't sustainable at current levels as California becomes hotter and drier due to climate change. A decline in almond production could lead to higher prices for consumers. A 4,600-year-old solar boat, once belonging to Pharaoh Khufu, has moved from its longtime home near the pyramids of Giza to the Grand Egyptian Museum. There, it will be preserved for future generations. With the boat's components found buried next to Khufu's Great Pyramid in 1954, archaeologists spent 20 months excavating over 1,200 fragments and an additional 10 years puzzling the pieces back together with historical accuracy. All right, I'm Nima Rajan, and that'll do it for your look at national and international news for today. For more news on demand, you could always visit our website or follow us on social media. Take care, Canada. We'll see you next time.